The scream cut through the roar of rushing water like a blade through silk, and Jack Zimmerman didn't think before he spurred his horse toward the sound. Rain had been hammering Del Rio, Texas, for 3 days straight in the spring of 1878, turning the normally placid creek that ran along the eastern edge of town into a churning monster that had swallowed fences, livestock, and anything else foolish enough to get in its way. Jack had been riding the perimeter of his ranch, checking for damaged property, when he heard her. The woman was waist-deep in the floodwaters, her arms flailing as she tried desperately to keep her balance against the current that wanted nothing more than to drag her under and sweep her away to the Rio Grande. He threw himself from his saddle before his mare had even come to a full stop, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a splash. The water was cold despite the relatively warm spring air, and it grabbed at his legs the moment he waded in. The woman screamed again, her dark hair plastered to her face, her dress billowing around her like a sail trying to catch the deadly current. "Hold on," Jack shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the roar. "I'm coming." The water was stronger than he'd anticipated, and for a moment he understood the terror in her eyes. It pulled at him with invisible hands, trying to knock his feet out from under him. But Jack had spent his 26 years working this land, building strength in his arms and legs from dawn to dusk labor, and he pushed forward through the chest-high water until he could grab her outstretched hand. Her fingers locked around his wrist with surprising strength, her brown eyes wide with panic. "I can't hold on much longer." "You don't have to," Jack said, wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her close against him. "I've got you now." He turned back toward the bank, fighting the current with every step. The woman clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, and he could feel her trembling. Or maybe that was him. The water had risen even in the short time since he'd entered it, and Jack realized with a spike of fear that if they didn't get out soon, they'd both be swept away. His boot found purchase on a submerged rock, and he used it to propel them forward. 3 more steps. 2. Then his hand caught the low-hanging branch of a cottonwood tree, and he hauled them both up onto the muddy bank, collapsing onto the ground with the woman still in his arms. They lay there for a moment, both gasping for breath, the rain still falling around them. Jack became aware of several things at once. The woman was shaking violently, her lips were starting to turn blue, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, even soaked and covered in mud. "Are you hurt?" he managed to ask, pushing himself up on his elbows. She shook her head, water streaming from her hair. "I don't think so. I was trying to save my horse. She got spooked by the water and I thought I could calm her, but then I slipped in the current." Her voice broke. "Thank you. You saved my life." Jack got to his feet and offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" She nodded and let him pull her up, though her legs seemed unsteady. He kept his arm around her waist to support her, and she didn't pull away. Up close, even in her bedraggled state, he could see the delicate features of her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw that suggested she wasn't someone who scared easily. "I'm Jack Zimmerman," he said. "My ranch is about a mile west of here." "Julia Brennan," she replied, and then her teeth started chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Jack looked around quickly. His horse had wandered a short distance away and was grazing nervously, but the woman's mount was nowhere to be seen. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and Julia was clearly heading toward hypothermia despite the relatively mild temperature. He needed to get her warm and dry and fast. "My ranch isn't far," he said. "Can you ride?" "Why, yes," Julia managed through chattering teeth. Jack whistled for his mare, and the horse trotted over obediently. He mounted first, then reached down and pulled Julia up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist without hesitation, pressing close for warmth, and Jack tried to ignore the way his heart kicked up its pace at her touch. The ride back to the ranch house seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Julia's shivering had gotten worse, and Jack could feel her slumping against his back. He urged the mare faster, relief flooding through him when the house finally came into view. It wasn't much, just a simple 2-story wooden structure that he'd built himself 3 years ago when he'd finally saved enough to buy this land, but it was solid and dry and had a good fireplace. Right now, that was all that mattered. Jack dismounted and caught Julia as she half fell from the saddle. Her legs buckled, and he didn't hesitate before sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her toward the house. She didn't protest, just turned her face into his shoulder as he kicked the door open and carried her inside. The house was cool but dry, and Jack set Julia down in a chair near the fireplace before quickly building up the fire. Within minutes, flames were crackling and spreading warmth through the room. He grabbed a blanket from his bedroom and wrapped it around Julia's shoulders, then went to put water on to boil for coffee. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, trying to keep his voice matter-of-fact. "I'll find you something dry to wear." Julia nodded, still shivering. Jack went upstairs and pulled out one of his shirts and a pair of trousers that would be far too big for her, but would at least be warm and dry. When he came back down, he handed them to her and gestured toward the bedroom. "You can change in there. I'll wait out here." "Thank you," Julia said softly. Her voice was steadier now, warming up along with the rest of her. While she changed, Jack stripped off his own soaked shirt and pulled on a dry one, then toweled his hair roughly dry. He was pouring coffee when Julia emerged from the bedroom. She looked almost comical swimming in his clothes, the shirt hanging nearly to her knees and the trousers rolled up several times at the ankles, but the color was already returning to her cheeks. "Better?" he asked, handing her a steaming cup. "Much better." She wrapped her hands around the cup and took a grateful sip. "I can't thank you enough, if you hadn't come along when you did." "Don't think about that," Jack said. "You're safe now, that's what matters." Julia studied him over the rim of her cup, and Jack felt suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "You just dove right in. Most people would have thought twice about risking their life for a stranger." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I wouldn't be much of a man if I'd left you there." A small smile touched Julia's lips. "Still, I'm grateful, and I apologize for being such a burden. Once the rain lets up and I can find my horse, I'll be on my way." "You're not going anywhere in this storm," Jack said firmly. "The water's still rising and you don't even know where your horse went. You'll stay here until it's safe." He expected her to argue, but Julia just nodded. "I suppose you're right. I don't even know where here is exactly. I'm new to Del Rio. Just arrived 2 weeks ago." "What brings you to Texas?" Jack asked. Settling into the chair across from her, Julia's expression grew complicated. "A fresh start, I suppose. My father passed away 6 months ago. He had a general store in St. Louis, and after he died, I tried to keep it running, but—" She trailed off, staring into her coffee. "Let's just say there were debts I didn't know about, and men who weren't interested in being patient with a woman trying to settle her father's affairs. I sold everything I could and came west. I heard Del Rio was growing, that there might be opportunities here." "I'm sorry about your father," Jack said quietly. "Thank you. He was a good man. I miss him every day." Julia looked up and Jack saw the strength in her eyes again, the determination. "But I'm not one for wallowing. I came here to build a new life, and that's what I intend to do. I've been working at the boarding house, saving money. Eventually, I'd like to open my own dress shop." Jack found himself smiling. "A dress shop in Del Rio, that's ambitious." "Why?" Julia's eyes flashed. "Because this is cattle country. Because women out here don't care about fashion. No, Jack said quickly, holding up his hands. "I just meant that it takes courage to start a business on your own, especially as a woman. I admire that." Julia's expression softened. "Oh, I'm sorry. I've gotten used to people underestimating me." "I don't think anyone who saw you fighting that current today would underestimate you," Jack said. "You didn't give up. A lot of people would have just let the water take them." "I'm too stubborn to drown," Julia said, and there was humor in her voice now. They talked as the afternoon wore on, the rain drumming steadily against the windows. Jack learned that Julia was 23 years old, that her mother had died when she was young, that she'd spent her childhood helping her father run his store and had learned to sew from a neighbor woman. She told him about St. Louis, about the busy streets and the riverboats, about how different everything felt out here in Texas. In turn, Jack told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about working as a ranch hand for years to save money for his own place, about finally finding this land and building his dream from the ground up. He told her about the challenges of running a ranch alone, about the hard winters and the dry summers and the constant battle to keep his small herd of cattle healthy and growing. "You do all this by yourself?" Julia asked, looking around the well-maintained house with new appreciation. "I have a couple of hands who help with the cattle," Jack said, "but mostly, yes, it's a lot of work, but it's mine. That matters to me." "I understand that," Julia said softly, "the wanting something that's yours." The rain continued into the evening, and Jack made dinner for them both. It was simple fare, just beans and salt pork and cornbread, but Julia ate with appreciation. Afterward, they sat by the fire again, and Jack found himself not wanting the evening to end. There was something about Julia that drew him in, something beyond her obvious beauty. She was smart and funny and brave, and when she laughed at one of his stories about a particularly stubborn bull, the sound filled the room like music. "I should let you get some rest," Jack said finally, reluctantly. "You can take my bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I couldn't put you out of your own bed," Julia protested. "You're not putting me anywhere," Jack said firmly. "I insist." Julia looked like she wanted to argue, but she was clearly exhausted. "Just for tonight," she said. "Tomorrow I'll find my horse and get back to town." But when tomorrow came, the rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. Jack went out to check on the livestock and came back soaked and grim-faced. The creek had jumped its banks entirely now, and the water was creeping steadily closer to the house. "How bad is it?" Julia asked when he came inside. "Bad," Jack admitted. "The road into town is flooded. We're stuck here until the water goes down." He expected her to be upset, but Julia just nodded calmly. "Then I'll make myself useful. What can I do to help?" Over the next 2 days, they worked together to prepare for the rising water. Jack moved his most valuable possessions upstairs, along with food supplies and blankets. Julia helped him secure the windows and doors, and she proved to be surprisingly strong and capable. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side, and Jack found himself increasingly aware of her presence, of the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, of the grace in her movements even in his oversized clothes. On the third night, the water reached the house. They were upstairs when they heard it lapping at the front door, and Jack felt his stomach drop. He'd known it might come to this, but hoping and knowing were different things. "Will it come upstairs?" Julia asked, standing close beside him at the window. "I don't think so," Jack said. "But if it does, we'll get on the roof." Julia's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his own. "I'm not scared," she said. "Not with you here." Jack turned to look at her, and something in her eyes made his breath catch. They were standing very close, and he could smell the faint scent of soap on her skin. Without thinking, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered against her cheek, and Julia leaned into his touch. "Julia," he said softly, and she rose up on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then Julia's arms went around his neck and Jack pulled her close, deepening the kiss. She tasted like coffee and something sweet, and kissing her felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you out of that water," he admitted. "I've wanted you to," Julia whispered back. They stood there in the dim lamplight, holding each other as the water rose below them, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. He'd been alone for so long, focused on building his ranch, on creating something lasting. He hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until Julia had burst into his life. Now, after just 3 days, he couldn't imagine her leaving. "Stay," he said suddenly. "When the water goes down, stay here. With me." Julia pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Jack, we barely know each other." "I know," he said. "And I know it's crazy, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. There's something about you, Julia. Something that makes me feel like I've been waiting my whole life for you to show up." "I feel it too," Julia admitted. "But that's all the more reason to be careful. I won't be some passing fancy for you. I won't give myself to a man who isn't serious." "I am serious," Jack said firmly. "Dead serious. I'm not saying we have to get married tomorrow, but stay. Get to know me. Let me get to know you properly. And if you still feel this pull between us in a few months, then we'll talk about the future." Julia was quiet for a long moment, and Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he waited for her answer. Finally, she smiled. "All right," she said. "I'll stay, but I'm not going to be idle, Jack Zimmerman. I'll work, and I'll save my money, and I'll contribute. I won't be a burden." "You could never be a burden," Jack said, and kissed her again to prove it. The water stayed high for another 2 days, but Jack didn't mind any more. He and Julia spent the time talking, learning everything they could about each other. They played cards by lamplight, cooked meals together in the makeshift kitchen they set up upstairs, and held each other through the long nights. Jack learned that Julia talked in her sleep, and that she was terrible at poker. Julia learned that Jack sang off-key when he thought no one was listening, and that he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking hard about something. When the water finally receded, it left behind a mess of mud and debris, but the house had held strong. Jack and Julia spent a week cleaning up, repairing damage, checking on the livestock. Jack's hands had managed to drive most of the cattle to higher ground, so his losses were minimal. Julia's horse turned up 3 days after the flood, grazing peacefully in a field 2 miles away, apparently none the worse for wear. By the time everything was back to relative normalcy, Julia had been at the ranch for nearly 3 weeks, and Jack couldn't remember what life had been like before her. She fit into his world so seamlessly it was as though she'd always been there. She took over the cooking, which Jack didn't mind at all since she was far better at it than he was, and she started a garden beside the house. She rode with him when he checked the fence lines and wasn't afraid to help with the hard work of ranch life. But more than that, she filled the house with laughter and warmth. She challenged him when they disagreed, which was often, but their arguments always ended in either laughter or kisses or both. She read to him in the evenings from the books she'd brought from St. Louis, and on Sundays they rode into town together for church, ignoring the curious looks and whispered comments from the other townspeople. Jack knew the gossip bothered Julia, though she tried to hide it. Del Rio was a small town, and a young unmarried woman living with a bachelor rancher was bound to cause talk. After a month, Jack couldn't take it anymore. He found Julia in the garden one evening, tending to the tomato plants she'd started. "Marry me," he said without preamble. Julia looked up, dirt on her hands and surprise on her face. "What? Marry me," Jack repeated, dropping to one knee right there in the dirt. "I know we said we'd wait, but I don't want to wait. I love you, Julia. I think I fell in love with you the moment I saw you fighting those floodwaters. Marry me and make this official. Make it forever." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You're sure? It's only been a month." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Jack said. "I wake up every morning grateful that storm happened because it brought you to me. I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine." "I love you too," Julia said and laughed as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Jack stood and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. She laughed and held onto him, and when he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and joy bursting in his chest. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Del Rio, with half the town in attendance. Julia wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Jack had bought her in town, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She looked so beautiful standing at the altar that Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. The ceremony was simple, but when Jack said his vows, promising to love and honor Julia for the rest of his days, he meant every word with a depth of feeling that surprised even him. And when Julia promised the same, her voice steady and clear, he saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. The townspeople threw them a party afterward, and Jack was touched by how many people had brought food and gifts. He realized that despite his tendency to keep to himself, he'd made more friends in Del Rio than he'd thought. Or maybe they were just happy to celebrate love, especially love that had started with such drama. Their first months of marriage were blissful. Jack had never lived with a woman before, had never experienced the intimacy of sharing his life so completely with another person. He loved waking up with Julia beside him, loved the sound of her singing while she worked, loved the way she would kiss him goodbye when he headed out to work and kiss him hello when he came back. Julia transformed the ranch house into a home. She made curtains for the windows and rugs for the floors, planted flowers around the front porch, and filled the rooms with small touches that made everything feel warmer and more welcoming. She also proved to be a skilled rancher's wife, learning quickly how to help with the livestock and even how to rope and brand cattle when the time came. But she didn't give up her own dreams. That fall, Julia opened her dress shop in town, setting up in a small storefront that Jack helped her lease. She worked there 3 days a week, taking orders and sewing beautiful garments for the women of Del Rio. Word of her talent spread quickly, and soon she had more business than she could handle. Jack was proud of her, loved seeing the satisfaction on her face when she completed a particularly challenging design, loved how she lit up when a customer praised her work. Their first year together passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. They had their struggles, of course. Jack could be stubborn and set in his ways, and Julia had a temper that flared when she felt he wasn't listening to her. They argued about money, about how much time Julia should spend at the shop versus at the ranch, about whether to expand the herd or wait another year. But they always made up, always found their way back to each other. And the making up, Jack discovered, was often the best part. He loved how Julia would come to him, her pride swallowed, and say she was sorry even when she wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. He tried to do the same, tried to meet her halfway, and gradually they learned how to fight fair and how to compromise. In the spring of 1879, Julia told him she was pregnant. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's someone in there," she said softly. "Someone who's half you and half me." Jack stared at her, the words taking a moment to sink in. Then joy exploded through him so powerfully he could barely breathe. "A baby! We're having a baby," Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Jack laughed and pulled her into his arms. "I'm over the moon. I'm terrified and thrilled, and I love you so much I can barely stand it." The pregnancy wasn't easy. Julia suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first 3 months, and Jack worried constantly about her. He hovered like a mother hen, which drove Julia crazy, until she finally told him firmly that she was pregnant, not dying, and needed him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "I'll be fine." But Jack couldn't help worrying. He'd lost his own mother to childbirth when he was young, had grown up knowing that bringing a child into the world was dangerous. He tried to hide his fears from Julia, but she knew him too well. "I'm strong," she told him one night, holding his face in her hands. "And I'm healthy. And I have you. Everything is going to be all right." Their son was born in December, just as the first snow of winter began to fall. The birth was long and difficult, and Jack spent most of it pacing in the front room while the midwife attended to Julia. He could hear her cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life, bargaining with God, promising anything if he would just keep Julia safe. When he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and angry in the cold air, Jack's knees nearly buckled with relief. The midwife, Mrs. Chen, a capable woman who delivered half the babies in Del Rio, came out smiling. "You have a healthy son," she said, "and your wife did wonderfully. She wants to see you." Jack rushed into the bedroom to find Julia propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant with a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up when he entered, and the love in her eyes made his breath catch. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Jack approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby. He was small and red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. He was the most beautiful thing Jack had ever seen after his mother. "Can I hold him?" Jack asked, his voice rough with emotion. Julia carefully transferred the baby into his arms, and Jack held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the weight of this tiny life, this perfect combination of him and the woman he loved. The baby opened his eyes, dark blue and unfocused, and Jack felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They discussed names during the pregnancy but hadn't settled on anything. Now, holding his son, only one name felt right. "James," Jack said. "After your father." Julia's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Really? Really? James Zimmerman, what do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Julia whispered. Fatherhood changed Jack in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd thought he understood love before, thought what he felt for Julia was the deepest emotion possible. But watching her nurse their son, seeing the fierce protective love in her eyes, unlocked something new in his chest. His family, his wife and his child. He would do anything for them, die for them without hesitation. The first few months were exhausting. James was colicky and cried often through the night, and both Jack and Julia stumbled through their days in a fog of sleeplessness. But there were also moments of piercing joy. The first time James smiled, the way he would quiet when Jack held him and sang the off-key lullabies that Julia always laughed at, the peaceful weight of him sleeping on Jack's chest. Julia couldn't work at the shop as much with a new baby, but she didn't seem to mind. She brought sewing projects home and worked on them while James slept, and Jack hired a young woman from town to help mind the shop on the days Julia couldn't be there. Money was tighter with 3 mouths to feed, but they managed. Jack was a good rancher, and the cattle prices had been strong. By the time James was walking, Toddling around the ranch house and getting into everything, Julia was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the fall of 1881 they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Elizabeth, after Jack's mother, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where James had been fussy and difficult, Elizabeth was calm and content, happy to lie in her cradle and observe the world with solemn dark eyes. "She's like you," Julia said one evening, watching Jack hold the baby. "Quiet and thoughtful." "And James is like you," Jack replied with a smile. All fire and determination. Life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch continued to prosper, and Jack was able to hire more hands, which gave him more time to spend with his growing family. Julia's shop had become one of the most successful businesses in Del Rio, and she trained 2 apprentices to help with the workload. They talked sometimes about expanding, maybe opening another shop in a neighboring town, but for now they were content with what they had. Jack loved watching Julia as a mother. She was patient but firm, loving but not indulgent, and she gave their children the kind of stable, warm upbringing that both she and Jack had longed for in their own childhoods. She taught James to read before he started school, and she sang to Elizabeth every night, the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Julia with a trip to San Antonio. They left the children with Mrs. Chen, who had become a close friend, and spent 3 days in the city like they were young and courting again. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked through the streets hand in hand. On their last night, they stood on the balcony of their room looking out at the city lights, and Jack wrapped his arms around Julia from behind. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up the life you might have had in St. Louis? You could have remarried someone with more money, more prospects. You could have had an easier life." Julia turned in his arms to face him, her expression serious. "Jack Zimmerman, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That flood was the best thing that ever happened to me. Getting swept up in that water brought me to you, and you are the best man I've ever known. You're kind and hardworking, and you love me and our children with your whole heart. I don't want an easier life. I want this life. I want you." "I love you," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "More now than the day I married you. More every single day." "I love you too," Julia replied and kissed him under the stars. The years continued to pass, marked by small joys and inevitable sorrows. Jack's favorite horse died of old age, and he mourned the animal like a friend. Julia's dress shop burned down one winter, but they rebuilt it together, making it even better than before. James started school and proved to be a bright, curious student. Elizabeth grew into a sweet, gentle child who loved animals and spent hours following Jack around the ranch. In 1884, Julia gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Thomas. He was a happy baby who laughed at everything and everyone, bringing constant joy to the household. Jack couldn't believe his good fortune sometimes, looking around at his family, at the life they'd built together. But life wasn't without its challenges. The winter of 1886 was brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that Jack lost a quarter of his herd. It was a devastating financial blow, and for a while, Jack worried they might lose the ranch. But Julia's shop income kept them afloat, and they made it through by being careful and working harder than ever. "We're a team," Julia reminded him during one particularly difficult night when Jack couldn't sleep for worrying. "We'll figure it out together. We always do." She was right. By the following spring, Jack had rebuilt his herd, and the ranch was back on solid footing. The experience had been frightening, but it had also shown Jack just how strong his partnership with Julia really was. They could weather any storm as long as they faced it together. As the years rolled by, Jack and Julia grew into their roles as pillars of the Del Rio community. Jack served on the town council for a term, helping to make decisions about the growing settlement. Julia organized a ladies' aid society that helped families in need and raised money for a new school building. They hosted gatherings at their ranch, and their home became known as a place of warmth and welcome. James grew into a tall, serious young man who showed an aptitude for ranching, and often told his father he wanted to take over the ranch someday. Elizabeth remained gentle and kind, developing a talent for drawing that amazed both her parents. Thomas was the family jokester, always making everyone laugh with his antics and observations. In 1890, on a warm spring evening much like the one when they'd first met, Jack and Julia sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James, now 10, was teaching 8-year-old Elizabeth how to rope a fence post, while 6-year-old Thomas provided commentary and suggestions that mostly served to make his siblings laugh. "Can you believe it's been 12 years?" Julia asked, her hand finding Jack's. "Since that flood." "Best damn flood of my life," Jack said, then glanced at the children and lowered his voice. "Sorry, best flood of my life," Julia laughed. "I was so scared that day. The water was so strong and I really thought I was going to die. And then you appeared like something out of a story and you didn't even hesitate." "How could I?" Jack said, squeezing her hand. "You were screaming, waist deep in those floodwaters. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Julia said firmly, "you did what a hero does. You risked your life for a stranger. You dove right in and pulled me to high ground, and you saved me in more ways than one." Jack turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his entire life. There were fine lines around her eyes now, threads of silver beginning to show in her dark hair, but she was even more beautiful to him than she'd been that first day. This was the face of his life, the face he wanted to see every morning and every night for whatever time they had left. "You saved me too," he said quietly. "I didn't even know I needed saving, but I did. I was so focused on building this ranch, on proving I could make something of myself, that I forgot there was more to life. You showed me what it means to have a family, to have a home, to have someone to share everything with. You made my life full, Julia. You made it matter." Tears sparkled in Julia's eyes. "We made each other better," she said. "That's what love is supposed to do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children and the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jack thought about the journey that had brought them here, about that terrifying moment when he'd waded into the floodwaters, not knowing if he'd be able to save the woman screaming for help. He thought about the choice he'd made in that instant to risk everything for a stranger and how that single decision had led to this, a life richer and more fulfilling than anything he'd imagined. "Thank you," Julia said suddenly. "For what?" "For jumping in. For not hesitating. For pulling me to high ground and then giving me a reason to stay there." Jack lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat," he said. "Every time, in every lifetime." As the years continued to unfold, the Zimmerman Ranch became one of the most prosperous in the region. Jack had a natural talent for breeding cattle, and his stock was sought after throughout Texas. But he never let success change who he was at his core. He still worked alongside his hands, still got up before dawn to check the fences, still treated everyone with the respect and fairness that had earned him a solid reputation. Julia's dress shop had expanded to 3 locations, with shops in Del Rio, San Antonio, and Eagle Pass. She trained a dozen apprentices over the years, many of whom had gone on to open their own establishments. She was known throughout South Texas as a businesswoman of uncommon skill and integrity, and Jack was intensely proud of her accomplishments. Their children grew and thrived. James, at 16, was already a skilled rancher who could rope and ride as well as any of the hired hands. He had his mother's determination and his father's steady temperament, and Jack knew the ranch would be in good hands when the time came to pass it on. Elizabeth, at 14, had developed into a talented artist whose drawings and paintings were beginning to attract attention. She was quiet and thoughtful like her father, but she had a core of steel that showed when anything threatened the people or animals she loved. She'd started helping the town doctor on weekends, assisting with minor procedures and learning about medicine. Thomas, at 12, remained the family comedian, but he'd also shown a surprising aptitude for mathematics and business. He loved working in Julia's shop, keeping the books and managing inventory, and he talked about maybe going to college someday to study commerce. In the summer of 1894, tragedy struck when a fire broke out in the barn during a lightning storm. Jack and James managed to get all the horses out safely, but Jack suffered serious burns to his hands and arms in the process. The doctor worried about infection, and for a week, Julia barely left Jack's side, changing his bandages and monitoring him constantly for signs of fever. Jack recovered, though his hands bore the scars for the rest of his life. But what stuck with him most from that experience was the fear he'd seen in Julia's eyes, the reminder that their time together, however long it might be, was precious and finite. "I need you to promise me something," he said to her one night as she was changing his bandages. "Anything," Julia replied. "If something happens to me, if I die before you do, I need you to promise you'll be all right. That you'll keep living, keep running the shop, keep being there for the children. Don't let grief consume you." Julia's hands stilled on the bandages, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were fierce. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. We're going to grow old together, Jack Zimmerman. We're going to be one of those couples who sit on the porch in their rocking chairs and watch their grandchildren play." "I hope so," Jack said, "but life doesn't always work out the way we want. I just need to know that if the worst happens, you'll be okay." "We'll both be okay," Julia said firmly, "because nothing is going to happen to either of us for a very long time. Now stop being morbid and let me finish these bandages." Jack smiled despite the pain in his hands. "Yes, madam." True to Julia's prediction, Jack made a full recovery. His hands healed, though they remained stiff and scarred, and he went back to working the ranch with the same dedication as always. The barn was rebuilt, bigger and better than before, and life returned to normal. In the fall of 1895, James fell in love. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was the daughter of a neighboring rancher. She was a sweet, practical girl who loved ranching as much as James did, and Jack and Julia both approved of the match. James was only 17, still young, but there was a steadiness to his relationship with Sarah that reminded Jack of his own relationship with Julia. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that brought together families from across the region. Jack walked his son down the aisle, and standing there watching James pledge his life to Sarah, he was struck by how fast time had passed. It seemed like only yesterday that James had been a tiny baby in his arms, and now here he was, a man starting his own family. "Where does the time go?" he murmured to Julia as they watched the newlyweds dance. "I don't know," Julia replied, leaning her head on his shoulder, "but I'm grateful for every moment we've had." James and Sarah built a house on the ranch, not far from the main house, and settled into married life. Within a year, they'd given Jack and Julia their first grandchild, a little girl named Emma. Watching Julia hold her granddaughter for the first time, seeing the pure joy on her face, Jack felt his heart swell with gratitude for the life they'd built together. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had decided to pursue medicine. At 18, she left for medical school in Baltimore, a decision that both thrilled and terrified her parents. The idea of their daughter traveling so far away was frightening, but they supported her dream. Elizabeth promised to write every week, and she kept that promise faithfully. Thomas, at 16, had proven himself invaluable to Julia's business operations. He had a mind for numbers and strategy that exceeded both his parents' abilities, and he'd helped Julia expand into mail-order business that dramatically increased their profits. He talked about staying in Del Rio, maybe taking over the business side of Julia's shops while she focused on the creative aspects. As the new century approached, Jack and Julia found themselves in their 40s, looking back on more than 20 years of marriage with satisfaction, and looking forward to whatever years remained with hope. The ranch was thriving, the business was successful, their children were healthy and happy and finding their own paths in the world. On New Year's Eve 1899, as the 19th century prepared to give way to the 20th, Jack and Julia hosted a party at the ranch. Friends and family came from miles around to celebrate, and the house was full of laughter and music and good food. At midnight, as everyone counted down to the new year, Jack pulled Julia close and kissed her as cheers erupted around them. "Here's to the next century," he said when they broke apart, "to whatever adventures it brings." "As long as we face them together," Julia replied, "I'm ready for anything." The early years of the new century brought changes to Del Rio and to the Zimmerman family. The town was growing rapidly, connected now by railroad to the rest of Texas and beyond. Modern conveniences were beginning to appear: telephones, electric lights, automobiles. Jack was skeptical of most of these newfangled inventions, but Julia embraced them enthusiastically, especially when electric lights were installed in her shops. Elizabeth graduated from medical school in 1902 and returned to Del Rio to open a practice. She was one of the few female doctors in Texas, and she faced skepticism and prejudice from some quarters, but her skill and dedication quickly won over most doubters. Jack and Julia were immensely proud of her, and Jack made sure everyone in the county knew his daughter was a doctor. James and Sarah had 3 more children in quick succession, giving Jack and Julia a total of 4 grandchildren. The ranch expanded to accommodate James's growing family, and father and son worked together, managing the operation. Jack found that he enjoyed this new phase of his life, where he could step back from some of the harder physical labor and focus on mentoring James and spending time with his grandchildren. Thomas married in 1904, choosing a sharp-minded young woman named Catherine, who had a head for business equal to his own. Together, they transformed Julia's dress shop enterprise into a regional empire, opening locations throughout South Texas and even expanding into New Mexico. Julia remained the creative force behind the designs, but she was happy to let Thomas and Catherine handle the business operations. By 1906, Jack and Julia were in their 50s and beginning to slow down a bit. Jack's joints ached more than they used to, especially on cold mornings, and Julia's eyes weren't as sharp as they once were, making the detailed sewing work more difficult. But they were still vital and active, still central to their family and their community. One spring evening, Jack found Julia in the garden she'd maintained for nearly 30 years. She was kneeling among the tomato plants, and for a moment, Jack was transported back to that evening when he'd proposed, when they'd been young and just beginning their life together. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, looking up as he approached. "That day I proposed to you," Jack admitted. "Right here in this very spot. You had dirt on your hands then too." Julia laughed and held up her hands, still dirty from working in the soil. "Some things never change." "Thank goodness for that," Jack said. settling down beside her on the ground despite his protesting knees. "Julia, I've been thinking. We've been so focused on building, on working, on making sure the kids and the business and the ranch were all taken care of. Maybe it's time we did something for ourselves." "What did you have to mind?" Julia asked, intrigued. "I want to travel with you," Jack said. "See some of the places we've always talked about but never gotten around to visiting. San Francisco, New York, maybe even Europe if you want." The kids are all grown and settled. The ranch practically runs itself with James in charge. Your business is in good hands with Thomas. We've earned some time to ourselves. Julia's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? You'd want to do that?" "I want to do everything with you," Jack said simply. "I have from the moment I pulled you out of that flood, and I will until the day I die." They spent the next year traveling, something they'd never really had the chance to do before. They visited San Francisco and marveled at the city rising from the ashes of the great earthquake. They went to New York and saw buildings so tall they made Jack dizzy just looking up at them. They took a ship across the Atlantic and spent a month in Europe, visiting Paris and London and Rome, seeing sights they'd only read about in books. But as wonderful as the travel was, both Jack and Julia found themselves eager to return home to Texas, to their ranch and their family. They'd built something special in Del Rio, something that called to them no matter how far they roamed. "There really is no place like home," Julia said as their train pulled into the Del Rio station in the spring of 1908. "Especially when home is with you," Jack replied, and meant it with his whole heart. Their homecoming was joyous, with the whole family gathered to welcome them back. The grandchildren, now ranging from toddlers to teenagers, clamored for stories about the places they'd seen. James had kept the ranch running smoothly in their absence. Elizabeth's medical practice had continued to grow, and she was now training other women who wanted to enter medicine. Thomas and Catherine had opened 2 more shop locations. Life settled back into familiar rhythms, but Jack and Julia both noticed they were slowing down more. Jack turned 60 in 1909, and Julia followed a few months later. They were still healthy and active, but they could no longer ignore the passage of time. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" Julia said one evening as they sat on the porch, their favorite spot to end each day. "The best life," Jack confirmed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you ever think about that day?" Julia asked. "The flood, all the time," Jack admitted. "I think about how different everything would be if I'd ridden a different direction that day, if I hadn't heard you screaming, if I'd hesitated even a moment longer." "I think we were meant to find each other," Julia said softly. "I think the universe or God or fate or whatever you want to call it brought us together. Some things are just meant to be." Jack reached over and took her hand, their fingers interlacing as naturally as breathing after 30 years together. "I believe that too. Out of all the places you could have been, all the paths I could have taken, we found each other in the middle of a flood. If that's not destiny, I don't know what is." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that had become as much a part of them as their own heartbeats. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and thriving. In the distance, they could see James and Sarah's house, lights glowing warmly in the windows. Somewhere in town, Elizabeth was likely still at her practice, treating one last patient. Thomas and Catherine's house, built on the other side of the ranch, showed signs of life as well. "We did good," Julia said. "With the children, with our lives, we did real good, Jack." "We did it together," Jack replied. "That's the only reason it worked." In the years that followed, Jack and Julia eased into the role of family elders. They were there for every grandchild's birthday, every school play, every important moment. They offered advice when asked and support always. Their home remained the heart of the family, the place everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. In 1912, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary with a huge party that brought together what seemed like half of Del Rio. People came to honor them, to celebrate a marriage that had become legendary in the area. Story of how they'd met had been told and retold, growing perhaps a bit more dramatic with each telling, but the core remained true. A woman in danger, a man who didn't hesitate to help, and a love that grew from that moment of crisis into something lasting and deep. Jack gave a speech that night, standing in his living room surrounded by family and friends. 33 years ago, I married the woman I pulled from a flood. I thought I was saving her life that day, and I suppose I was. But what I didn't know then was that she was saving mine too. Julia Brennan Zimmerman, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You've given me a family, a home, a purpose beyond just existing. You've made every day an adventure and every night a comfort. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. Here's to 33 more years if God is willing. There wasn't a dry eye in the house by the time he finished, and Julia was crying openly as she stood and embraced him. I love you too, she whispered in his ear, forever and always. As they moved into their 60s and 70s, Jack and Julia's health began to decline more noticeably. Jack developed a heart condition that required medication and rest, something he grudgingly accepted. Julia's arthritis made her beloved sewing increasingly difficult, though she still designed new patterns that her apprentices executed. But despite the physical limitations that came with age, their love never wavered. If anything, it deepened. They'd been together through so much, good times and bad, triumphs and tragedies, joys and sorrows. They'd raised 3 children together, built successful businesses, created a legacy that would outlast them both. In the spring of 1918, as another war raged in Europe and the world seemed to be changing faster than ever, Jack and Julia celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller and quieter than the one for their 33rd, just close family gathered around their table. But it was no less meaningful. 40 years, Jack said, looking around at their children, now middle-aged themselves, and their grandchildren, some of whom were nearly grown. 40 years since I made the best decision of my life. The best decision was mine, Julia countered with a smile. Saying yes to a muddy cowboy who proposed in a garden. We're both lucky then, Jack said and raised his glass. To 40 more. They didn't get 40 more years, but they got several more good ones. Jack passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1923, just a few months after his 74th birthday. He died as he'd lived the last 45 years of his life, with Julia beside him, holding his hand. The funeral was one of the largest Del Rio had ever seen. People came from across Texas to pay their respects to a man who'd been respected and loved throughout the region. But no one grieved more deeply than Julia, who felt as though half of herself had been torn away. True to the promise Jack had extracted from her decades earlier, Julia didn't let grief consume her. She mourned deeply, as was right and proper, but she also kept living. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, continued to design for her shops, maintained the garden she'd tended for 45 years, and sat on the porch every evening, remembering. She lived for another 7 years, and they were good years, full of love and family. She saw great-grandchildren born, saw her businesses continue to thrive, saw the ranch that Jack had built with his own hands prosper under James's careful stewardship. Julia Brennan Zimmerman passed away in the spring of 1930, on a day when the creek was running high from recent rains. She was 81 years old, and she died surrounded by family, with Elizabeth holding her hand and James sitting at the foot of her bed and Thomas reading to her from one of her favorite books. Her last words were about Jack. "I see him," she whispered, her face lighting up with joy. "He's waiting for me. My cowboy who pulled me from the floodwaters. He's waiting to take me to high ground." And then she was gone, passing peacefully from this world to whatever lay beyond. They buried her next to Jack on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the creek where their story had begun. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and dates, and beneath that, a single line. Two lives joined by a flood, parted only by death, reunited in eternity. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down through James's line. Julia's dress shops eventually closed as fashions changed and the world moved on, but the buildings remained, repurposed for new uses. The house where Jack and Julia had lived for more than 40 years became something of a landmark in Del Rio, preserved by the family as a reminder of where they'd all come from. And the story of how it all began, of a woman waist-deep in floodwaters screaming and a cowboy who dove in without hesitation to pull her to high ground, became part of the family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It became a story about courage and love, about the unexpected ways our lives can change in a single moment, about building something lasting from the most dramatic of beginnings. Years turned into decades and decades into a century, but the essence of Jack and Julia's story remained. That love can spring from crisis, that the choice to help a stranger can change your entire life, that devotion and partnership and shared purpose can create something that lasts far beyond a single lifetime. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world Jack and Julia could never have imagined, with computers and smartphones and interstate highways, still told the story. Still marveled at the courage it took for their great-great-grandfather to wade into those churning waters. Still celebrated the love that grew from that single act of heroism. The creek still flooded sometimes, though modern engineering had tamed it somewhat. The ranch still operated, though much changed from Jack's day. Del Rio had grown into a proper city, with all the conveniences and complications that came with progress. But on certain spring evenings, when the light hit the land just right and the wind carried the scent of rain, you could almost see them. A young cowboy and the woman he'd saved, sitting on the porch of their house, hands intertwined, watching the sunset together. Because some loves are so powerful, so fundamental, that they leave an imprint on the world that lasts long after the lovers themselves are gone. Jack and Julia's love was like that. It had started in crisis, grown through partnership, deepened through time, and ultimately became something that transcended their mortal lives. It became the foundation upon which generations built their lives. It became an example of what marriage could be at its best. Two people choosing each other every single day, through good times and bad, through youth and age, through everything life threw at them. In the end, that's what their story was really about. Not just the dramatic rescue that brought them together, though that made for a compelling beginning. It was about everything that came after, the daily choice to love, to support, to build together. The decision to face life as partners rather than as individuals. The commitment to family and community and each other that never wavered even as decades passed and the world changed around them. Jack had dove into those floodwaters to save a stranger, and in doing so, he'd saved himself. He'd found his purpose, his partner, his home. And Julia, pulled from those waters to high ground, had found the same things. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, something that continued to ripple outward long after they were gone, touching lives they'd never know, inspiring love stories they'd never hear. That was their legacy. Not the ranch or the business or the material things they'd accumulated, though those had their place. Their real legacy was the love they'd shared and the example they'd set. It was in the way their children had learned to love their own partners, in the values they'd passed down through the generations, in the very foundation of the family they'd created together. And if you believe the romantics in the family, the ones who like to think such things matter, that legacy included two spirits who never really left the ranch at all, who could still be found on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of the house they'd built together, holding hands and watching the sunset, content in the knowledge that their love had been exactly what love should be: transformative, enduring, and true. The floodwaters that had nearly claimed Julia's life in 1878 had instead been the catalyst for one of the greatest love stories Del Rio had ever known. And every time the creek rose, every time the rains came heavy and the water rushed past the old ranch house, it seemed like the land itself was remembering that day. The day a woman screamed for help and a cowboy dove in without hesitation. The day two strangers' lives collided in the most dramatic way possible and set in motion a love story that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. That was the real magic of it all. Not just that they'd found each other, though that was remarkable enough, but that they'd built something from that chance encounter that mattered, that lasted, that made the world a little bit better for having existed. Jack and Julia Zimmerman had lived and loved and died, as all people do. But the love they'd shared, the life they'd built together, the family they'd created, all of that lived on. In the land they'd worked, in the descendants who carried their names and their values, in the stories told around dinner tables and at family gatherings. And perhaps most importantly, in the lesson their story taught. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is not hesitate when someone needs help. That a single act of courage can change not just one life, but many. That love, real love, is built not just in dramatic moments but in thousands of ordinary days spent side by side, choosing each other again and again. That was the story of Jack and Julia Zimmerman. A story that started with floodwaters and a rescue, and ended decades later with two people who'd lived full, rich lives surrounded by family and love. A story that proved that happily ever after wasn't just the stuff of fairy tales, but something real people could achieve through love, commitment, and the daily choice to be partners in every sense of the word. And on spring evenings in Del Rio, Texas, when the creek runs high and the sun sets in brilliant colors over the land, if you listen carefully, you might hear an echo of laughter. The sound of a woman who was saved from drowning and a man who found his purpose in saving her. The sound of a love that started in crisis and grew into something eternal. Their story had ended as all stories must. But the love remained, woven into the very fabric of the land and the family they'd created. Eternal, unbreakable, true, and that, in the end, was the happiest ending of all.